Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, one of our Magonomia episodes about the inadvisability of using a carriage as a getaway vehicle. In Elizabeth's England, if you want to make a fast getaway, you use a horse, except if you're in London, where you slope down to the river and embark surreptitiously with the help of a convenient waterman. You don't, surprisingly, use a carriage. That being said, at the end I'll discuss some ways to trick your carriage out. Initially, the lack of carriages is purely a technological matter. No one in England has them before 1555. They did have working vehicles like drays and wagons, and for transport they have huge carts, richly furnished and slow as molasses. These are used for parades and royal progresses. They were the descendants of a Saxon invention, which was basically a wagon with a hammock in it for moving people too frail to ride. Americans thinking of carts in Oregon Trail aren't far off. Just add a lot of fabric and then gild everything else that's still visible. Even after the earliest carriages are brought into England, they are not popular in some circles. Part of the reason for this is practical. The roads are terrible and suspension is rudimentary. The second is that they are initially considered effeminate and then later considered debauched. One poet slightly after the reign asked if it was carriages which popularised tobacco or the other way round. So they do become available as conveyances late in the reign. Like so many other industries, carriage making takes a huge leap forward when all the Dutch refugees show up and establish new manufactures following the War of Independence with Spain. Another problem is mechanical. Steering systems are rudimentary. On a fixed axle, the wheels can't move at different speeds without slippage, so cornering is slow and wide compared to modern vehicles, even modern carriages. Single-axle carts can be a bit more nimble because effectively they sway about on the traces between the animal drawing the cart and the vehicle. Having multiple fixed axles makes this far worse. That doesn't matter on drays that are carting crops, but it does create a problem for a dashing agent wanting to tear around a corner while flinging smoke bombs at her foes. The earliest, and by the end of the reign, really the only solution, was to mount the front axle on a pin so that the two front wheels could swivel to follow the horse pulling the carriage. This has a couple of problems, though. It compromises the tray of the wagon, and it makes it unstable. The surface area of a wagon's tray determines how much stuff you can carry, and therefore how much cargo you can haul per trip. Once you've decided your cargo is actually some people in seats, you can make the axles a bit longer than the tray of the wagon to give yourself more room to manoeuvre. You can also make the body of the carriage waisted, that is, you can have it narrower where the wheels are. Some carriages are narrower from the bottom to the top, which makes them even more top-heavy than you'd imagine, while some are wider at the back since the rear axle doesn't steer. Eventually, in later carriages, the front axle is moved so far forward of the passenger box that part of the wheels can go under the body of the carriage. Another thing you can do is make the front wheels smaller than the back wheels. Again, this lets you get them closer to a full rotation in the space you have between them being parallel to the side of the carriage and turning to strike the guard that stops them hitting the carriage wall. This also helps in designs where the axle has been moved forward. The small wheels can go under the connection between the box where passengers sit and the space where the driver sits. The second problem is, from a stability perspective, you've turned the carriage into a big tricycle. On a wagon with two dead axles, when you hit a pothole with one of the forward wheels, that wheel dips a bit, but your other front wheel acts as a sort of drag to stop it being knocked too far offline. With a pivoting front axle, things work the other way. Hitting a pothole means that both of your front wheels swerve. This is why in carriages, the person of honour sits at the back facing forwards. They get jolted around less. Similarly, if you're in an accident, your wheels aren't necessarily holding the corners of the carriage up. Effectively, they're holding up a top-heavy T-shape. This is why so many carriages flip over, even at what modern people would consider low speeds. Time to crack out the really weird bits of history. If you don't want to ride, what's your posh way of getting from place to place early on? And the answer is the horse litter. A horse litter is basically a carriage, but instead of wheels, it has a horse at the front and another one at the back. This uses the knees of the horses as shock absorbers, so it's considered far more suitable for ladies and for the unwell. Sometimes they're led by a man who's walking, sometimes the front horse has a rider, sometimes Rarely, the rear horse is replaced by people, but that's fancy and pointless for actual travel. It's how Catherine of Aragon entered London, though. Horse in front, 8 guys in the back. Elizabeth herself did have a carriage. Actually, it may have been a coach, which is basically a carriage that has 4 corner posts. Its sides were made of wicker, and the panels could be peeled away, so she was visible to her people. There wasn't any coach glazing at the time, so far as I can tell, so there was no view directly forward of the passengers. It was likely slow, as it was drawn by 2 horses. Coaches with 6 horses weren't known in England until the reign of James I, so there was no careening about. It was also probably quite uncomfortable. The box where the passengers sit was probably hanging on chains or leather straps, rather than directly attached to the axle, but they are still terrible. Elizabeth, for example, used to ride 2 places, switch to her coach for the parade, and then switch back. As an example of this, Elizabeth II, the current queen, has a gilded coach for state occasions, which weighs 4 tons, and is so uncomfortable to ride in, we have testimony about how terrible it is from 4 monarchs. When people who have done blue water naval service in wooden ships tell you this is the worst ride of their life, their coach is truly terrible. Liz, too, refused to use it in her latest Jubilee parade because she's in her 80s and she doesn't have the health or time for this sort of business. Her new coaches have modern shock absorbers, air conditioning and power windows because she's already got one that's historical but a bit rubbish. The source I'm using, which is Carriages and Coaches, The History and Evolution by Ralph Strauss, link on the blog that accompanies the podcast, says that by 1585 many of the nobility and some wealthy commoners owned private coaches, and indeed certain enterprising tradesmen, as will appear, let other coaches on hire at so much per day. Indeed, everyone of any wealth was eager to possess them. A private coach settled any doubts as to your quality. It was a new fashion, a new excitement. From such details, it is possible to imagine what this and other coaches of the time were like. Figure a huge, gaudy, curtained apparatus with projecting sides and incomplete panels, large enough to contain a fair-sized bed, hung roughly from 4 posts and capable of being dragged at little better than a snail's pace. 4-wheeled tortoises, Taylor calls them, along roads hardly worthy of the name. 20 miles a day was considered good going. The coachman, as we learn from the water poet, was mounted, his fellow horses and himself being all in a finery, with as many varieties of laces, facings, clothes, and colours as there are in the rainbow. Nor was he over polite, particularly if the coach he drove was hired. I'll break in at this point to note that although you could have your coach kept somewhere for you to use when required, or you could hire a coach by the day, ranks of hackney coaches for hire by the trip don't appear before 1633, with the first one being in the Strand. At least that's in England. Over in France, they seem to have sprung up in front of popular taverns. So they have much the same system we use in Australia today. But back to Strauss. They seem to think that their finery allowed them to treat pedestrians with but scant respect, and no wonder these way-stopping whirligigs, as Taylor calls the coaches, surprised the inhabitants. When one of them was seen for the first time, some said it was a great crab shell brought out of China, and some imagined it to be a pagan temple in which the cannibals adored the devil. For some time, indeed, coaches must have given the common folk something to think about. In fact, the coach, according to poor Taylor, is directly responsible for every calamity from which the country has suffered since its introduction. Leather has become dearer, the horses in their traces are being prostituted, and there is a universal decay of the best ash trees. As an aside, sedan chairs seem to date from around the time of Elizabeth's death. The historian I'm quoting doubtfully records it as being due to Buckingham again. He was the guy who introduced coaches with 6 horses, saying that he saw sedan chairs in Spain when he visited it with Prince Charles, and he brought 3 back with him, supposedly. Eventually, Sir Saunders Durkham, who was an ally of Buckingham's, is given a sedan chair monopoly for 14 years. At much the same time, coaches were banned from London streets unless the occupants were travelling at least 3 miles beyond the city. So it was profitable for a while, but then people just started ignoring the law about coaches. Note that in the rules of the road, right-of-way seems to be a bit odd at this time. Basically, it's rich dudes go first, based on the idea of precedence. There's a humorous pamphlet put about at about the same time, where a sedan chair operator and a coachman are stuck at a narrow point, arguing who should wait for the other on the basis that the coach is in the service of a duke, but the chair is not empty but actually contains a knight at that very moment. After arguing for hours, a beer cart, a two-wheeler, claims precedence over both of them as having come into the country with Henry VII and being of far greater use. You'll note that by Sherlock Holmes's time, hackney cabs were also two-wheelers. It makes them better able to navigate between coaches in traffic. How to trick out your carriage. The first thing you need to consider is where you might stash equipment in your carriage. By tradition, a lone driver carries a gun within his seat, and if he has a driving partner, they sit up the front with a gun. The shotgun has, however, not yet been invented, so you can't call shotgun on the outside seat. The box in which the passengers ride also provides space for mechanisms and armaments, although line of sight to fire is not particularly good. The roof of the carriage could be used to store material, or could have a hole cut in it to allow material inside to be dispensed. At the back, many carriages have a storage box, the ancestor of the modern car boot, which might also have destructive elements. A difference from the modern car that might be useful is that carriages have a very high comparative clearance. The carriage doesn't need a drive shaft or fuel tank, so there's a lot of free space under the floor between the axles. As to what your weapons need do, carriages are already terrible, so you just need to make them slightly worse. Making the road slippery, making it difficult to see, making it hard to steer, all work without the need to shoot the coachman. You can't shoot out the tyres of a coach because it doesn't have them. Wheels are made of wood with little metal plates nailed on. The steel hoops around wheels that you see at Renaissance fairs haven't been invented yet. You can, however, crack a wheel spoke, and that can cause dangerous accidents because the carriage is, again, top-heavy and unstable. A problem with using a carriage as a weapons platform is that horses spook very easily, even trained horses. Modern horses are perfectly willing to shy at a shadow or a piece of litter, which is why they wear blinders to stop them seeing peripherally. Their forebears were even more likely to bolt if they heard a sudden explosion behind them. People may imagine that carriage accidents were rare because horses will not, for example, run themselves into walls. But the opposite's the case. Horses, when startled, don't really think things through at all. They just run and hope for the best. In a chase scene, you may not be too bothered if your horses are sprinting, but it makes steering wider and worse, and it uses up your horse's energy, so they can't sprint again until the horse has caught its breath. There are ways to make horses go faster artificially, various tonics used by horse leeches to win races, but during the thick of combat or the dash of a chase, do you really want to be trying to force ginger up your horse's bottom? I wouldn't, but your saga may vary.